Hi everyone, welcome to our next learning module for EDCI 595. This learning module focuses on instructional grouping. So if we dial back a little bit, we started off our semester by examining what is differentiation. It's really the bread and butter of effective gifted education services. In that learning module, we talked about how quality pre-assessment is the first step for differentiation to be successful. So pre-assessment is all about what groups are we going to place the students in order to help them learn most effectively. Remember, we have to be careful about which pre-assessments we use, and we need to remember that we can differentiate beyond just academic readiness, but also for interest and for learning preference. So, instructional grouping. Instructional grouping is kind of like the methodology for differentiation to actually work. So this is the meat of it. What will we actually do in the classroom, and what will this look like? So we have two main forms of instructional grouping. The first is static, and the second is flexible. Okay? So just to give you a little bit of a visual here, we have two main types of instructional grouping. So static and flexible. Right off the bat, you should remember the importance of this flexible word, okay? Static is basically going back to that idea of tracking, right? And remember, we talked about when we use tracking, then it's really hard for students to jump from one track to the next. So tracking is really not good practice. And instructional grouping that is static, meaning it doesn't really change, is basically tracking. So a lot of times within the field of education, when you say ability grouping or instructional grouping, this is what people think of. Particularly more seasoned teachers who have been around longer, they hear that word of ability grouping and they think static, which is not good practice because that means that we are starting off students on one track and they basically have to stay there. So when we talk about instructional grouping for differentiation, we really want to focus here on flexible grouping. Okay, so there's two types, static and flexible. And of course, we want to focus on that flexible. Now, within flexible grouping, we have a bunch of different types of grouping arrangements. Okay, so flexible grouping is kind of like the overall term here. And then you have various types of flexible grouping arrangements. I won't go through all of these, but for example, one that we'll definitely focus on in your content this week is a cluster group. You'll also see heterogeneous or homogeneous. Of course, those are not the same, but you'll see both of those terms. And there are several others. I'll just put a little ... right? Okay, so our second type being flexible. Then you have various grouping arrangements that can achieve that flexible flexible grouping. So you'll definitely see a lot in your content about cluster grouping. You'll see some heterogeneous grouping, homogeneous grouping, right? So those are just various different strategies to achieve the flexible grouping. One thing that I want to make really clear here is when we use flexible grouping, there's not a right or a wrong in the exact arrangement that we use. But there are a couple of very important considerations to make. So the first consideration would be, what do you use as your pre-assessment, right? So hopefully within Module 2, I convinced you of the importance of pre-assessment. You can't forget that, right? So in order to make decisions in terms of these flexible groups, really consider which pre-assessment or pre-assessments are you using? You want to be careful to keep those pre-assessments close to the content, meaning I want that to be very valid in measuring actually what I'll be doing in these groups, instead of relying on another test that says their general ability in something. You want the assessment that you're using to sort into groups to be really, really well aligned to what you would be doing within those groups. Okay, so the first consideration would be a pre-assessment. The next consideration is, honestly, what will you do in the instructional groups? Okay, so that's kind of your second reason here. Now that seems kind of obvious, but I want you to think about it. Your students, you get to know them, right? So if you're considering, I'm doing a unit and it's going to be a lot of group work, but I think I'm going to have some groups that are smaller and that have a little bit more of an independent focus, right? That's telling me a lot about their learning preferences. So I should probably use a pre-assessment, not necessarily on ability, but also including their preferences in terms of how they learn. If you are planning to do a differentiated classroom assignment that is focused on one very specific unit, so for example, if you are doing a unit on, say you're doing a unit on the Iditarod. I, for some reason, remember studying that when I was younger, right? You're going to probably need a pretty specific pre-assessment on that, okay? I would not depend on an ability test to help me really know how much students know about the Iditarod, right? That wouldn't make sense. So consider, how specific is this content? Can I actually understand my students' knowledge of this content by a greater size test, like a standardized test? Or do I need to give a more specific pre-assessment in order to really best group my students? Okay? I'm just going to reiterate that. This needs to be flexible, right? So, of course, oftentimes your groups will look similar because we do want to place students who are high ability with their intellectual peers. But keep your assignment in mind. If it's going to look different, then of course you may group differently, okay? And the last thing I want you to always consider is your logistical challenges, okay? So yeah, it'd be great if we could differentiate into 5 groups. Do you have 5 clean, you can tell it's COVID. Do you have five quiet classrooms? Do you have 5 teachers, right? Is there a pep rally going on in this other area, right? So don't just think idealistically in this. You also need to be thinking about logistical challenges, resources, time, things like that. Okay, so there's your brief overview of instructional grouping. Again, you've got 2 types. You've got static and you have flexible. We don't want to track our students, but we do want to have flexible grouping so we can meet them where they are and challenge them appropriately. Within the type of flexible grouping that we've looked at, there are various different arrangements. So you'll see various different ones in your content. And then, of course, you want to keep these considerations in mind. Okay, so consider, what pre-assessment am I using? What will I actually do in these groups? Am I being flexible and recognizing I don't have the same groups every time? And this is the real world. Are we being logistical? Are we being practical? So that's a very brief overview of instructional grouping. Along with this module, you have 2 assignments. So you have both a discussion board and you have an application assignment. So the case study is, at first, it sounds a little confusing. It's very real world. This is a transcript of a teacher meeting. They are working to group their students for a math unit. Now, this group of teachers has various pre-assessment data They have ability testing data, but they also created a pre-assessment, and it's a little bit more related to the content. So they're realizing that which pre-assessment they use will impact how they make the actual groups. I will say that this case study is longer than most. Don't get bogged down. I gave you all of those details for a reason, and that is because your discussion prompt is to discuss the challenges that these teachers are facing. So it's not always easy to do instructional grouping. And I want you to discuss what are the challenges that these teachers are facing and be very specific in that. Additionally, in that discussion board post, if you were a teacher in that group, how would you stick up for the importance of instructional grouping and say, hey, this is worth it. We really do need to use instructional grouping for our students. So that's your discussion board. In terms of your application assignment, I'm challenging you to think of, from the scenario in your case study, how would you potentially group these gifted students along with all of their classmates? So one thing to make really clear, guys, there's not a right and a wrong for this assignment. Differentiation can work in a lot of different ways, and there's a lot of practical things we have to consider. So really the purpose of this grouping assignment is to allow you to put yourself in the teacher's perspective and say, what would I do in this scenario of this case study? How would I group the students? And can I defend my answer? I am giving you the option of completing this application assignment with a peer. So I've created a discussion board link where you can post with each other if you'd like to work together. If you do choose that option, please make sure that everyone in your group posts the work so that I can assign everyone a grade. So that's your very brief intro to instructional grouping. Just to reiterate, the instructional grouping is kind of like the actual practice of differentiation. We've talked all about theory and why we need to differentiate, and then we talked about how to pre-assess. Now we're doing it, right? So we've got the importance down, and this module is all about practicality. What will this actually look like in the classroom? I hope that you all are doing quite well, and as always, I'm happy to answer any questions.